day, and welcome to the previewing the Restoring Internet Freedom NPRM conference call. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. Later, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions during the question-and-answer session. To register to ask a question, you may press the star and 1 on your touch-tone telephone. Please note this call may be recorded. I'll be standing by if you should need any assistance. It is now my pleasure to turn the conference over to Mr. Larry Spywak. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Teleforum. We, as the title said, we're going to try to preview the Restoring Internet Freedom NPRM, which the FCC is expected to vote on tomorrow. We have, very fortunately, an excellent set of panelists, which I'll introduce here real quick. We're going to start with our good friend Angela Giancarlo, who's a partner over at Mayer Brown. We have our old friend Russ Hanser, who's a partner over at Wilkinson Barker. With me, as always, is my partner, Dr. George Ford, who's the chief economist of the Phoenix Center. And again, my name is Larry Spywak. I'm the president of the Phoenix Center. So what we are going to try to do today, with the FCC's new transparency, we have a unique opportunity. We now kind of know what the NPRM is going to do, although could be subject to change after the vote tomorrow. But what we're going to try to do is take a very dispassionate view of the legal and the economic and the policy issues raised by the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. For format, what I'm going to try to do is follow the organizational flow of the NPRM so we can sort of discuss it in order. For those interested in tweeting, just a real quick administrative note, the hashtag is our standard Twitter hashtag, which is phxpolicy. And so, again, what we're going to try to do is the NPRM, when you really get rid of the political hyperbole, raises a lot of complex issues. And as we all know who've been doing this event, and Phoenix Center audiences are usually pretty sophisticated, so I'm sure I don't need to tell people listening on the call how long this debate's been going on in the various battles. But here we are. Now 12 years into the process, we've gone from the 4 freedoms to the FCC's first attempt, which was then shot down by the D.C. Circuit and Comcast, and then we had the 2010 rules, which were then shot down by the court in Verizon v. FCC, and then we had the 2015 Open Internet rules where the FCC pulled the nuclear option and reclassified, and that was upheld by the D.C. Circuit and U.S. Telecom v. FCC. And now we have the current FCC proposing now to reverse the last decision. So my first question, and this is a legal question, and I throw this out to Angela and to Russ, you have a case where, we just, in the last 2 years, was this giant zeitgeist of reclassification. There were a lot of arguments raised about it, but the D.C. Circuit upheld it, and we can get into that discussion what the standard is. And now the commission is going to go back to the court 1 year later and say, changed my mind. So, Russ, as an initial start, if you wouldn't mind, what is the standard of review that the court is going to have to look at? In other words, that the commission is going to have to satisfy to justify to a court, because I have no doubt that these set of rules or this action, whatever it is going to go back to the courts. What is the standard review that the FCC's got to get over to justify its unreclassification?
Sure, and thanks for having me. So with respect to the unreclassification, that will mainly be an issue of statutory interpretation, so it will mainly be an issue subject to the traditional Chevron standard. Chevron, as the lawyers know anyway, is a standard that says when a statute is unambiguous, then the agency has to do what the statute says if it speaks directly to the issue at question, and if it doesn't, it can be overturned. But if the statute is ambiguous on the point at issue, then the agency gets a lot more leeway and is entitled to deference so long as the interpretation it chooses is reasonable. So that will be the main standard applied for the reclassification piece, and we can talk in a bit about what that means given the proximity to the last decision. But to answer your question, that the question will be, was this a reasonable interpretation? And I guess I'll just add, assuming the reclassification goes back to where the commission was before the 2015 Open Internet Order, In other words, assuming we go back to a decision that broadband internet access is an integrated information service, conveniently we have a Supreme Court decision from 2005, the Brand X decision, that squarely addressed this very issue. Namely, was that a reasonable interpretation of the Communications Act and its definitions? And the Supreme Court, in that case, said yes, it was.
Well, Angela, let me ask you this question. I mean, how do you think, assuming it goes back to the D.C. Circuit, a court would react to such a rapid reversal? I mean, Russ makes an excellent point in terms of there is the Brand X case, which he's referring to, but still the court used a lot of, I don't want to use political capital, but judicial capital in a very long decision. I mean, do you think it would go back to the D.C. Circuit? I mean, how do you think a court would react to that?
Well, Larry, first of all, let me thank you for having me today. It's really an honor to be with you. Let me make a couple of observations that will lead to, I think, and lend a little bit more flavor to this question. First of all, when you look at the actual draft rules that are attached to the NPRM, that reflects that only 8.11 is the only rule that's going to be repealed, which is the general conduct rule. So it's really everything else staying the same. Furthermore, even the pay prioritization is still there, and perhaps most importantly, the formal complaint procedures are staying. So I just, we're not, it doesn't seem like this is, certainly it's a very passionate topic and everyone has a view, and I don't know that anyone is going to be, anyone's going to be so moved to change their view, but I think it's important to keep things in perspective. With respect to the standard of review, I think I would also put into the mix the Fox case, which certainly allows the FCC and other agencies to change their mind as long as they can explain why they changed their mind. And of course, that leads us directly to the way it seems this proceeding is going to be handled, which is it takes a very dispassionate tone, to use the word that you quoted earlier, Larry, about our discussion today. I was, personally very thrilled to see that this document really returned to what a government rulemaking should look like. It doesn't read like an advocacy pronouncement, and it's also very thorough. We're soliciting a cost-benefit analysis. We're discussing Section 222. We're discussing Lifeline. I really believe that the PI FCC is focused on facts and data, and which will serve them well as far as Chevron and the Fox precedent.
Okay, well then let me ask this question again to the lawyers. I think one of the criticisms of the U.S. telecom case was that it gave far more deference than was appropriate, I guess is a polite way of describing it, to an agency decision under Chevron. Does that now act as a double-edged sword for if the FCC now wants to reclassify? So in other words, they go back to the court because, well, you said we have great deference. Here's your own precedent. I mean, does that sort of hold, you think?
In my view, I'm sorry. Do you want to go first, Russ?
Oh, go ahead.
I've given that some thought, and I have to believe that yes, it would, because the only other outcome is that the only other conclusion one could make was that the U.S. telecom case was outcome-driven. So to the extent that the court relies on its own precedent, I have to believe the answer would be yes.
So I also think that the precedent here, counsels in favor of deference. I do think, the U.S. Telecom Court hung its hat a bit on Brand X and the finding in Brand X at the relevant terms, which were the definitions of information service and telecommunications service, and the use of the word offer within those definitions. So Brand X had found that was an inherently ambiguous term, and it was susceptible of at least the meaning that the FCC had given it in 2002 and 2005. Well, in 2002, sorry, Brand X was about the 2002 decision. And then U.S. Telecom, if you take it as read, and it's the law of the land for now, if you take it as it is, U.S. Telecom says that the language is also amenable to the opposite definition. So there is the courts collectively have given a lot of wiggle room within those definitions, and I do think that gives the current commission a lot of leeway to reclassify, declassify. Essentially the courts together have said this word can mean either of two things that are effectively opposites. So that does give the agency a lot of discretion, and I think it's hard for the court to come back, especially given the Supreme Court precedent. It would be very hard for the court to come back and say, no, these definitions are not susceptible of the meaning that the Supreme Court held they were susceptible to 12 years ago. And on that point, Larry, to get to the question you hinted at a few minutes ago, I don't think the timing, the alleged proximity, I guess, to the last decision really changes much. Built into Chevron is the idea that agencies change their mind. Chevron itself was a case in which the Reagan administration, the Reagan administration had adopted a different position than the prior administration and changed its mind. And there's no piece of that analysis that says, well, if it's too close, then you don't get the same deference. Chevron acknowledges that, among other things, different political administrations will take different positions and will come to a statute with different regulatory philosophies. And I think there's a good case that's largely what's happening here.
Okay, so that was excellent. Okay, so building then on that last question, let's drill down here for a moment. So again, keeping ourselves to the reclassification question, we'll get to the other stuff in a moment. But the reclassification, what do we think is at the FCC in terms of what they're looking for in terms of asking the question, but where they're going? Their primary legal argument is going to be, my reading of the NPRM is that they're really rehashing much of the statutory definitional argument. Is that that's where they can sort of hang their hat, you think, in this proceeding?
I think, legally that's likely. I think Brendan Carr, the general counsel, is very strong and very smart, and I have every reason to expect that an order on this issue would spend quite a bit of time on those questions. The 2015 order took a fairly aggressive position on the degree to which the transmission component of broadband internet access was integrated with other functionalities provided by that service, holding ultimately that for the most part the transmission and the processing were separate, and that where they were intertwined, they were only intertwined to facilitate the management of a telecom service. Both those pieces of the analysis are questionable. I've been involved in the litigation challenging those conclusions, and I suspect that the current commission, if it goes in the direction it proposes to or seems to propose to in the notice, it will spend a fair bit of time explaining why the processing and transmission components are at least as integrated as they were in 2005, and probably, frankly, more so, and may also revisit that decision about the network management exception to the information service definition and explain why, as the ISPs explained in their briefs to the court, why the functionalities involved in caching and DNS and so on do a lot more than simply facilitate a telecom service.
Angela, you got anything?
Yeah, I guess the way I think about it is the structure. I think part of that argument is the structure of Title II is a poor fit for regulating broadband internet access service. It's clunky, and it just by its nature, has raised uncertainty. And when the original 2015 order, when in reaching their conclusions, they applied of Title II 20 separate sections in whole or in part, 14 more than mentioned in the notice, P.S. And the order goes on to temporarily forbear from applying 15 different sections. Title II is massive, and it's massive for a reason. It's because it's old. And I think part of the argument certainly is going to be that this was trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, and that there has to be a simpler, cleaner way to do it.
Which is the subject of a forthcoming paper I'm working on. But as wonderful as I love talking law...
I'm glad I could do that for you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, as much as I talking law, let's move over one moment to the policy aspect. I mean, I do think at the end of the day this is a legal call, but you're going to have some policy rationale to justify that. And one of the things that the NPRM, I think, focuses on a lot, there's a huge fight going on, is the question of Title II on investment. And there's a lot of stuff going back and forth. But as it just so happens, we at the Phoenix Center just released a paper on investment yesterday and have done some other work. So I'd like to pull George in a little bit to talk about investment effects of reclassification. So George, just real quick, do you think the FCC, as the FCC cited our paper, I guess it's fair game to talk about the paper. So George?
Well, I think investment's going to be a part. It played a central role in the NPRM. The chairman has discussed it on numerous occasions. I think that it's fairly obvious that network neutrality, or that Title II, or really network neutrality generally as we construct it, would deter investment and foreclose certain avenues for innovation, but innovation might take a different route that might be more preferable. It's hard to say. So, yeah, I think that's going to be an important part of it. I think we've seen the numbers recently that are only going to facilitate the use of the investment argument. The wireless industry's numbers just came out. Investment down there is down. The investment in that industry is down significantly. I've done a couple of analyses. I go back. I think the reclassification problem has hung over the industry since 2010, and that's based on in part a conversation we had at the symposium with Frank Lauthan at Raymond James, who basically had said the same thing, that reclassification was just sort of this cloud hanging over the industry for many years, and firms were hedging on investment, and the empirical evidence seems to support that. The Free Press came out with a study earlier this week. If you break that thing apart, you can actually see that investment in 2016 is down significantly. So I think that story's there. Personally, as an economist, I don't think we should be really focused on investment, mainly because capital expenditures doesn't really equal investment from the economic standpoint. A bad law could increase capital expenditures, so that's not a valid reason. In fact, we moved from rate of return regulation to price caps in order to stop firms from overinvesting in their networks. So investment is not a valid policy objective. Or capital expenditures, I should say, is not a valid policy objective. Investment, properly defined, the way an economist would define it, might be, but that's quite difficult to quantify. But yeah, I think the evidence is lined up. I think that'll be an important part of the discussion.
Thank you, George. Okay, so having discussed the reclassification question, that the commission, that's the big thing they're going to reclassify. Let's move to the next item on the NPRM, where they're going to, a quick question on the removal of the general conduct standard. Now, to me, when I first saw the general conduct standard, being on a paper on this a couple years ago, it seemed to me that this was the commission modeled the general conduct standard on the non-exclusive checklist that the D.C. Circuit approved in the data roaming case in Selco. And it seems to me that I think what the chairman was trying to do was say, well, you want a case-by-case approach, you have it. And when it went up for review in the D.C. Circuit and U.S. Telecom, the industry had said, oh, it's too vague, and the court said, no, it's not. But you do have this. And so Jeet has said that Chairman Pai has said that it's just still too vague and it's too powerful, and it's just caused a lot. What I like to do is take a moment here. Russ and Angela, you guys actually advise clients and give legal opinions where you have to put your malpractice on the line. What's been the practical effect, without telling tales out of school, but the practical effect that you have found in ensuring compliance with the general conduct standard? Has it been onerous? Has it been okay? Have you had to say no a lot? What's that been like?
I mean, so I'll say that the practical effect of the general conduct standard has been to take dollars out of investment budgets and put them into law firm expenditures. And in some cases, at least past the margin or at the margins, the effect of the general conduct standard has been to cause companies to decide not to roll out service plans or offerings that would have or probably would have or might have benefited consumers. So again, I can't tell tales out of school, but the Wheeler Commission made clear that it was going to take a fairly aggressive view of certain kinds of behavior, and the result of that is that companies that didn't want to face large enforcement penalties, and frankly, it didn't want to have to defend their practices even if it didn't result in a penalty, went and gave money to lawyers and either delayed or decided ultimately not to roll out products. And I always joke when that happens, that's great for my daughter's college fund, but it's bad for America. There'll be a lot of discussion of the empirical investment effects, and folks like George have their work cut out for them because there's a lot of data to comb through and figure out. But at a theoretical level, I think the question of whether vague, expansive, uncertain regulatory obligations dampen investment, that the answer to that question is so obvious as to make it a fairly uninteresting question. Of course that's true when companies are spending money trying to figure out what the rules are. And just to anticipatorily address one other statement I've heard in this debate, people will say, well, how is it any different from the vague standards in Section 201 and 202 of the Act, which have been in place for 80-plus years? Those are inherently vague standards as well. And to some degree, it's right that those are inherently vague standards. The difference is they were applied to early 20th century and late 19th century telecommunications technologies that were not subject to rapid advance and were not subject to constant innovation. So when you try to apply, this goes back to Angela's point about the fit of Title II, when you try to apply those vague mother may I, nobody knows what's allowed and what's not requirements to plans and services and technologies that are changing by the day, it gums up the works a lot more than it does when you apply it to a technology that doesn't change over the course of decades.
Angela?
Larry, what I would say is just a little bit of background. When I was over on the floor, it was always a very thorough debate as to whether or not to include lists or examples.
The floor being eighth floor when you were working for Rob.
Right.
Right. Angela was Rob McDowell's chief of staff, so just.
Oh, thank you.
Hey,
sorry.
What can I do?
Our preference was never to include lists or suggestions because the concern was, and we see this, we could see this playing out, is that it sets a people don't know if it's a floor or if it's a ceiling. And if you have something unique that doesn't fit into one of those list checkpoints, then what do you do? So that too adds to the uncertainty. Another thing I would say is we have a transparency issue here too. The quote-unquote investigations of some of the wireless carrier practices that began in, I believe it was December of 2015, there wasn't any light shed on those. They were not part of a public docket. They were not available. And I'm not necessarily advocating that they should have been, but it there again, it just, it doesn't really help the community. The advisory opinions that came out muddied the water even further. They were not particularly helpful and raised seem to raise more questions than provide answers. And on top of all this, the Commission has limited resources at the end of the day, and it's easy to believe that there were a whole bunch of, bodies and smart brains put on these types of tasks that maybe could have been doing other work that would have been more fruitful.
Gotcha. Well, that's an excellent segue. Thank you, Angela. Into the next portion of section of the discussion, which is the FCC is asking about what it should do about the bright line rules. Now, again, by a bit of historical context, these rules, essentially the same rules that were in 2010, everybody, with the obvious exception of Verizon, had signed off on these rules. They've, a lot of people were unhappy, but if you were to ask these companies, they said, look, I'm not thrilled with these rules, but I can run my business and we can move this aside. And so there was a general consensus about the rules. Well, we've now had the implementation of these rules, for now a year and a half, 2 years. And the FCC, in reading the NPRM, I think is the best way to describe it, seems to be very agnostic about the rules. It doesn't say it's going to implement the rules. It doesn't say it's going to get rid of the rules. It just asks the question, should we have these rules or not? Which I think is an interesting way, and perhaps is I think both Russ and Angela said a moment ago, a constructive way to have a discussion about what these rules are. So let's sort of walk through, just sort of, again, bringing back in George Ford here for a moment. Probably the biggest rule that people are talking about is the no paid prioritization rule. From an economist standpoint, George, does that make any sense?
No, I don't really think there should be some blanket prohibition against paid prioritization. I don't think there's any business plan for it per se, although you might throw zero rating into that kind of scheme. It's not prioritization necessarily, but it's a differential pricing scheme. I don't think that there's any economic justification for it. It's really it's all. I mean, when I think about paid prioritization, I can't help but think about payola in the radio business. And I think a lot of times people think about the internet as being constrained in some way where you can charge a fee on scarcity, and that's just really not the way the internet works. It can do many, many things all at the same time. Everybody can be on a different website without any sort of restraint, whereas in the radio business, of course, they play one song at a time, and there's only so many radio stations on the air. So I think the whole idea is very convoluted and comes from a thinking that doesn't really match well with the way the internet works. So I don't think there should be a rule. I think it should be much more general than what they're proposing, and really focused on anti-competitive behavior in sort of broad sense.
Russ and Angela, do you have any comment on paid prioritization?
I think I will defer to the economist.
All right.
I am not as wise as Angela, so I'll just say one other thing, which is, so this morning I got up and I went to my car, and the first thing I did was grab my paper copy of the New York Times because I'm ancient and still get a paper. And I paid a certain amount to get that copy of the New York Times, but that was not fully reflective of the cost because the New York Times also charged advertisers a lot of money to have their ads in that paper. That is what's known as a two-sided market. New York Times gets money from me, gets money from the advertisers, and part of the value of the product is matching me to the advertisers. The same thing is true of credit cards, where sometimes we pay a fee for our credit card, but the vendors where we use the credit card are also paying money to the credit card company. These kind of two-sided platforms are not that uncommon. So the idea of an ISP obtaining some sort of payment from a content provider is not is not that unusual, and shouldn't strike people as that unusual. That itself is not, as one blogger said recently, evidence of market power. Now, to George's point, whether there's a business model for it or not, I don't know, but I don't think we should be inherently frightened of a two-sided market structure.
And I concur with Russ. I mean, the economic literature is fairly clear about this. If you charge on the other side of the market, that doesn't have to be in some sort of pay prioritization scheme. It could just be some general termination tariff. So there's a distinction. Zero rating 2 is not obvious to me that would be considered pay prioritization. But yeah, when you charge the other side of the market, the prices on the user side of the market are going to go down. And it's interesting, I think it was in the 2010 order, the FCC made some arguments about investment, and they had cited a paper, an academic paper on it as support, and then they rejected the idea that charges on the terminating side of the market would lower price on the user side of the market, but the very paper they cited for the investment argument had a formal proof that it would lower the price on the user side. So that's, to the economist at least, it's fairly obvious that getting some money on the other side of the market is going to lower price on the user side of the market, which will help with adoption and probably deployment too.
Okay. I mean, I have my views on pay prioritization, but as the moderator, I will just publish my paper, and you guys can read that later. So here's the other one that I think is actually probably the most shocking in terms of the rule, is the transparency rule. For the last 7-8 years, everybody had talked about, who could be against the transparency rule. In fact, it wasn't even appealed when the 2010 rules went up in Verizon. They literally said, well, nobody appealed it, that's that, and literally in one sentence. Yet, I think, Angela, going to your point, if you recall, a year and a half ago, AT&T, and I don't think the case actually went anywhere, but the commission fined AT&T $100 million for allegedly violating the transparency rule. Does that go to your point about how should, enforcement excess, perhaps is a better way of describing it?
Well, I wouldn't be the first person to say yes.
On
this call, you would be.
Yeah. Certainly that's been discussed and debated, and Commissioner Pai, then Commissioner Pai, and Commissioner O'Reilly certainly have done their fair share in critiquing the Enforcement Bureau under FCC Chairman Wheeler. So, to the extent that a client provides a transparent disclosure of exactly what the company is doing with the data, with the speeds, and identifies every relevant point. It's maybe I'm a Pollyanna, but that to me would not violate a transparency rule. But yet it seems like the efforts have been to discount what companies have been or believe they have been doing properly.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Moving on to the next topic, which is always a popular one, legal authority. This is something that we have been grasping with in the net neutrality debate since it's happening, is what is, if you reclassify broadband internet access as a Title I service, to the extent there is a problem, what is the legal authority? Let's start with the biggest one, which is most controversial at this point, is Section 706. Having been rereading the U.S. Telecom case in anticipation of this Teleforum, what's interesting to me is that the court, its prior readings of Section 706 authority have been what I would call sort of a super ancillary jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. Yes, it's an independent source of authority, but it's not unfettered. You have to tie it back to a specific section in the Act. In the court, there's quite a few cases about this. In U.S. Telecom, the court said, oh, no. In fact, Section 706, one could argue, could trump even Sections 201 and 202. Chairman Pai, who's been a critic of Section 706 authority for many years, has now put into the order that do we think that Section 706 is oratory? So where are we? Do we think? I mean, it's an open question of what you've got the court. At least one court saying Section 706 is this true independent source of authority that you can even do rate making independent of 201, 202, and you've got the commission going, I don't believe you. What do we do about Section 706 authority, if anything? Russ, I'll throw it to you first.
It is really a hard question. The D.C. Circuit, obviously in the Verizon decision, found that found that the FCC was reasonable in determining that 706 was not hortatory, but was instead an independent grant, albeit, as you said, a fettered grant, not an unfettered grant.
I always wanted to be fettered. I prefer to be fettered, but fettered to be.
So what do we do? I don't know. We've had in the last round of this debate, folks who were proponents of strong net neutrality rules argued that Section 706 was inadequate, insufficient. Clearly, there's language in the Verizon decision that says you could do much of what you want to do with 706, just you can't go straight for the full common carriage. I'm inclined to think that the best option here is to go to Congress and try to get some certainty, because otherwise I worry about this becoming a political football where the basis for authority and the rules change every time the administration changes.
That's the next topic.
Okay, well, I'll hold off on that. So let me just say that short of Congress, I also want to throw in a term that we've gone 42 minutes without mentioning, which is the Federal Trade Commission, right? If broadband internet access is reclassified as an information service, then the FTC regains its authority. There's some nuances there. We'll talk about maybe the AT&T case in a bit. But
yes.
The FTC regains authority. The FTC has long and broad experience dealing with transparency kind of issues, and also has additional responsibilities with respect to consumer protection and unfair business practices and such. So there's a lot that the FTC could do under a reclassification regime, even shy of congressional action, and that might help us avoid some of the questions about Section 706.
Angela?
I don't really have much to add to that. I mean, I agree with Russ. It certainly is the thorniest of questions. I think that while I do think that the chances for legislation are very low, it would certainly be a wonderful turn of events if there was some legislation to guide the agency here. I mean, there are 706 is an option. Larry, you raised the possibility of Section 230. There are choices, and we also have the roadmap from the Verizon case for using Section 706, but I'm not sure that there's a perfect answer absent specific legislation.
Ancillary jurisdiction is also available, too. I mean, one of the things I found when I did a paper, Judge Tatel, who wrote what I call the Holy Trinity, which is Comcast, Cellco, and Verizon. This was prior to U.S. Telecom, but he was always very adamant that he said, ancillary jurisdiction is alive and well. The commission just had done a very poor job of articulating a case.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really kind of a soup.
Right.
There are choices, but none of them taste very good.
Well, then let's move then sort of to our final topic, which we do talk about legislation. Angela, because you do a lot of Capitol Hill work in your practice. What are you hearing? Is there a chance? Or are we just resigned to a world where, the next time there's a change in power, we're back doing this again? Which goes to Russ's point. It's great for our kids' college education, but it's not necessarily great for America.
Well, honestly,
much as I like Brooke.
Yeah. I that's my fear. That is my fear. I think we all might agree. It seems at this point that the chances are quite low for legislation, but it certainly would be ideal, and that would resolve the issue. But I just don't see a willingness on the part of the Democrats to come to the table. Mr. Nelson, Senator Nelson, specifically spoke to this at the last hearing pertaining to communications issues, and it was difficult to hear.
All right, so we've got this NPRM, but I think, as Angela pointed out at the very beginning, this is a very complex fabric, and when you start tugging at one string, a lot of things start to unravel. So we touched on a little bit throughout the call, but I want to revisit them in particular. Let's go back to the AT&T case for a moment, because I think that's a really important case and will play into how the FCC does the rules. For those who are unfamiliar with the AT&T case, just a quick summary. Prior to reclassification, the FTC had sued AT&T for allegedly, under Section 5 of the FTC Act, for allegedly deceptive practices for not disclosing their unlimited data throttling policies. AT&T argued, no, under what's called a common carrier exemption, it is not activity-based, because even though I have a lot of my business Title II service, this particular service is a Title I service. It's not whether I'm activity-based, it's whether I'm status-based. And the Ninth Circuit actually bought that argument and said, somehow if you're always a common carrier, thou shalt always be a common carrier, even if one is engaged in unregulated activities. The logic of that case is, I think, just as a general policy matter, very problematic, as many people on this call, our good friend, Acting Chairman Maureen Olhausen, the Federal Trade Commission, said, by that same logic, a railroad, a pharmaceutical company, for example, could have itself acquired by a railroad, and therefore it is out of FTC jurisdiction. I mean, it has implications far beyond the telecom world. And I guess last month, if I stand corrected, the Ninth Circuit decided to grant rehearing en banc of that case and said very specifically in the order that the original decision is no longer precedent in the Ninth Circuit, which is an interesting indication. So assuming that happens, Russ, would that clear up a lot of the problems? Because one of the wrinkle about, even if you reclassify, so long as that Ninth Circuit case is on the books, it really doesn't matter, because you still then have this gray area of the FTC with the common carrier exception. Admittedly, it was one court, but still.
Right, but it was one court, but it was the court that had addressed the issue thus far, and it was a Federal Court of Appeals. So I do think it clears up a lot of uncertainty. Again, the import, if the en banc court overturns the panel, and the signal suggests that it will, then we're back into what you rightly referred to as the activities-based approach to the common carrier exemption, which means a common carrier is not subject to the FTC's jurisdiction when it is acting as a common carrier, but it is subject to the FTC's jurisdiction when it's not. And if broadband internet access were reclassified to be an information service once again, then ISPs would not be common carriers when acting as ISPs, and the FTC would have authority to take enforcement with respect to deceptive or unfair practices. I think that's important because, notwithstanding what some folks say, everyone in this debate wants there to be a cop on the beat. Everyone. The ISPs want that. Public interest folks want that. We all want there to be some cop on the beat and someone who's able to enforce something in cases where things go wrong. I think folks who represent ISPs, I do tend to think that the market's going to take care of a lot of that without the enforcement. But yes, we want someone there to make sure that action can be taken if things go awry. And the Ninth Circuit's en banc decision, or the decision to take the case en banc, and then hypothetically a decision by the en banc court reversing the panel, would clarify that the FTC does stand ready to enforce, especially the promises made by ISPs to their customers.
Okay. Angela?
I don't have anything to add on that one.
Okay. All right. So here's the last legal question. I think it's really interesting in the sense of, it is my view, and again I've got a paper coming out on this, that U.S. Telecom was an extremely poorly reasoned decision on a lot of technical issues that I need not go into now. But for whatever reason, it is the law of the land at this point. Now, the question is, and I think we're going to be dealing with its aftermath in a lot of different contexts for years to come. So this is what's interesting to me, is that, do we think a few people have said that the interveners have said they're going to appeal and seek certiorari of U.S. Telecom. Question for the panel: is that likely? What do we think the odds are that the Supreme Court is going to take cert, particularly in light of the fact that the FCC is saying, well, never mind, we're going to go back and do this again? Or do we think it raises enough issues of law, maybe the major rules doctrine, that the court would be enticed to take certiorari? So, Angela, I'll start with you on that.
I think that this is kind of a difficult question. First of all, just remembering back to last summer, there was a general recognition that this would be a very difficult case to overturn, and there were all sorts of fun hypothetical conversations about who would fill Justice Scalia's seat, whether there would be a well-written, thorough dissent on a decision for en banc rehearing. Frankly, primary question was who was going to win the election and who was going to have the opportunity to fill Justice Scalia's seat. So here we are where, Justice Scalia's seat is filled. We have two very thorough, articulate dissents on the panel decision. But at the same time, now we have an FCC that is in transition on these rules. So does that give the Supreme Court an out to decline to take the case? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but it certainly adds to the discussion and to the debate.
Russ?
So I got out of the prediction game somewhere around 11 p.m. on November 8th.
There's an honest answer.
And I'll just add, as a counsel to one of the parties in the litigation, I probably shouldn't opine on the likelihood. Sort of questions are always iffy. Very few cases get taken. I do, while I have the floor, and we're talking about the decisions, would note, to me, one of the most interesting aspects of the case was not in the panel decision, but in the recent en banc denial concurrence authored by Judge Srinivasan, which came out, I guess, about 2 weeks ago now, in which, in responding to some First Amendment arguments, Judge Srinivasan made, I thought, a somewhat surprising set of statements about what the 2015 order said. And effectively, some ISPs, not the ones I represent, but some ISPs had said they have a First Amendment interest in not carrying messages or content they don't like. And in response, Judge Srinivasan said, well, no, if you hold yourself out as a common carrier and you tell your customers you're going to be carrying their traffic to and from anywhere they want on the Internet, then you've surrendered that right and you've taken yourself out of the editorialization game. But, of course, if you don't hold yourself out that way, if you tell your customers that you're only going to allow them access to certain websites or that you're going to throttle certain websites or what have you, well, that's a different story, because then you're not a common carrier, then you're not a biased provider, broadband Internet access service provider under the rules, and the rules just don't apply to you in the first place then, which I thought was rather, again, interesting, because I take it to suggest that if an ISP wants to, in addition to its normal broadband Internet access service, offer kind of a skinny package, or a package that says we'll block whoever we want, or a package that says you can only get access to these following websites, as long as they're upfront about that takes them outside the scope of the rules, which, I don't know, but I suspect was not the intent of all the people involved in writing those rules in the first place.
Okay, well, in our few remaining moments, thank you, Russell. We'd like to open it up to maybe one or two questions if we have time, so I know everybody's wanting to get to lunch. So the moderator, do we have any questions in the queue?
We do have a question, and as a reminder, it is star one if you'd like to ask a question. We'll go to the line of Mariam Bakash from Morning Consult. Please go ahead.
Okay.
Hi.
Hey, morning. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us. My question is for Mr. Ford, the economist. I'm just hoping that he can clarify in words rather than numbers how he nailed down, or how he assesses that he nailed down the reduction in investment that he saw in the counterfactual II Title II classification?
Maybe the easiest way to think about it is a twin study. A lot of times when epidemiologists want to study the effect of something, they'll look at twins and say you wanted to determine whether smoking cigarettes cause lung cancer or whatever it might be, and you got one twin that smokes and one twin that doesn't, and the twins that smoke have a higher incidence of cancer. And from that you can say, well, the genetic equivalent of the other guy didn't get lung cancer. The one that smoked did, so we think that's pretty strong evidence that smoking causes cancer. What I did was I said, let's look at the investment patterns of the communications industry over 30 years or so, and let's find other industries that followed the same pattern. So you look across a bunch of industries. I think there were probably 70 I looked at, and you say, okay, which one of these industries or which set of these industries follows most closely the investment pattern over time, the trend over time of the communications sector. And I found three. In the second paper, I added a couple more where you find basically the investment twin of the communication sector. And then you say, okay, they followed each other's patterns almost the same over this 30-year period. What happens in this period, the last 5 years of the data, when something happened to the industry, the communications industry in 2010? And what you find is that the patterns of investment behaviors departed from the control group and the communications industry. So the twin got lung cancer. So that's the way that the thing works. You find the equivalent, and then you set a date, and you say, okay, things changed here, and then you ask, well, is it still equal after the event? And if it's not equal after the event, then we attribute that difference to whatever that event was. In the same way you test a drug or the relationship of smoking to cancer or whatever.
And in this instance, the twin for the communication industry was... Who was the twin?
The twin for the communications industry was a set of industry sectors. It included some manufacturing sectors, transportation sector. But the standard by which you chose them is solely based not on the industry, what the industry does, but solely based on how well that industry's investment behaviors match the investment behavior of the communication sector.
I see. Thanks.
Yep.
All righty. I have been told that there are no more questions, so I would like to thank...
Question?
Any more questions? I was told there's no more questions.
I have one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
This goes back to Russ's point earlier. We've got a court that the FCC is at a fork in the road. Title I, Title II. The courts have said you can go left, you can go right. You got the authority to do that. Okay, so that's really not a question of deference anymore, I don't think. They've determined they can do it. You've got the Chevron case, as Russ pointed out, which was basically a political change, motivated by a change in the White House. Is there? I don't know how these appeals work at the D.C. Circuit of these orders, but is there a motion for summary judgment?
So, in an appeal, there wouldn't be a motion for summary judgment. There would be. My guess is the briefing, the folks who challenged such a reclassification would argue that it wasn't within the, something was new about this order that took it outside the scope of what the Brand X court decided, or that it was, too sudden a change and that somehow that made the difference. I would say, though, that won't be the only issue in the case. Angela early on mentioned the Fox decision, which governs I guess what I'd call the other side of the inquiry, which is not do you have statutory authority, but was your policy prescription arbitrary and capricious? And I think a lot of the action will be focused on that separate set of questions, whether or not the FCC had the legal authority to go left or right. Did it adequately defend its decision, for example, to eliminate the general conduct standard, if that's what it does. And the agency gets a lot of deference there as well, and it is allowed to change its mind. It does under the Fox decision and a more recent decision known as Perez. It does have authority to do all that, and it has to explain. It has to explain that it has to recognize that it's changing course, which I think they will do, and it has to explain not why the new course is better than the last course, but why the new course is appropriate given the evidence before it. And I think that's where, George, your work and other work on investment effects of the last regime will be really critical, because they'll, I imagine, be talking a lot about the policy rationale for making the change, and the investment effects will play, I suspect, a starring role in that story.
So the issue that's likely to be litigated is not even the reclassification part at all. It's more likely the impact on the rules.
Well, I'd say it's all likely to be litigated, but I'd say, for the reasons you state, I don't think that's going to. I think the court would quickly, assuming the FCC just went back to what it had, the status quo before 2015. I think that would be quickly affirmed, again, based on what you say, the fact that we have precedent out there saying that was a reasonable approach.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Question answered. Okay. Well, again, I would like to first thank everybody who dialed in. I would like to thank our panelists, Angela Giancarlo, Russ Hanser, my partner George. And this is the first announcement I'm going to make. We'll be putting this up on our website probably by next week. For those of you who love this topic and can't get enough, the Phoenix Center will be holding its annual Phoenix Center Rooftop Policy Roundtable on Wednesday, June 14th, where the working title will be What to Do About Title II. Only instead of sitting on our phones, we will have an open bar, hors d'oeuvres, and cigars, and talking policy under the stars. So keep tuned to the Phoenix Center's website for this. Hopefully you can all join us. Again, thank you to everybody. This was an excellent conversation, and it's going to be an interesting couple of months as this process unfolds yet again. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you, Larry.